without further ado, I am going to invite both of our speakers up. First, I am going to introduce Rio Oxas. Rio Oxas was born and raised in the Los Angeles neighborhood of Echo Park. Their parents are from Guatemala and El Salvador. Since 2002, Rio has been working with Black, Indigenous people of color, communities, and government agencies around issues of mobility justice. Rio is currently the Building Power Director for for Mobility Justice. Rio holds a master's in education and social justice and is a national bicycle safety coach. And we were talking earlier today, and I could talk to you for hours, so I cannot wait to hear you speak. I think you're going to go first for us. And then after Rio, we are going to have Crissy Fanganello. Is that right? Fanganello. All right. Is that Italian? Yes. All right. Yeah, I am half Italian. So Fanganello, Crissy Fanganello. Crissy worked in Denver to establish a people-centric transportation approach. She initiated dozens of people-oriented plans, including a series of multimodal plans and Vision Zero. Crissy opened city. That was like me being half Italian really created a mumble amongst you guys. That's kind of interesting. Crissy opened City Builder, in 2018 and offering insight and strategy on leadership, diversity, inclusion, and stakeholder engagement. In 2019, Crissy joined Panasonic, exploring how technology can address pollution, safety, increase efficiency, and generate revenue. And without further ado, I think Rio's going to start, and Crissy's going to pick up, and then we're going to engage in conversations. Get your Slido questions. As you guys are coming up with questions, please enter those questions, and we will be collecting those questions. Thanks.
All right, thank you. Hello, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rio Oxas again. I use they, them, their pronouns, and as stated earlier, I have roots in Los Angeles, but my parents are rooted in Central America. I'm going to begin first by kind of bringing in the family aspect about it. I never know where I'm going to head towards until I get up in the stage, but it seemed really relevant because the theme was really just kind of subtly integrated in a lot of people's conversations. So this particular picture here, I'm going to open up with and talk about this. So I'm calling it Family Love for Streets, because one of the things that I'm learning about is that unless we are thinking about people on the streets as our own children or our own elders, we're never going to get it right. And so this particular picture has Ichel Guralares, who's my partner's daughter, and we are literally in Anaheim streets, and Orange County is not known for safe streets, by the way, and we're literally riding together. And I think that's an important element, that if you are going to design streets, that can you put your body on the line with your children and your elders? That's really the question. Can you do it? And if you can see it at that level, at the kids' eyes level, you're going to be a lot more impactful. So that's kind of the theme of today's conversation. I'm going to move. How do I click over?
The clicker should be right there. You got it?
All right.
There you go.
Great. So centering our families. Again, that's going to be the conversation. And I know we're talking about complete streets, and I know we're talking about economic development that infuses it. But if we're unable to look at fundamentally, literally our hearts and our values, it doesn't matter how many technical checklists, what verbiage, what language you're going to use, you're never going to get to it. You're never going to really understand the importance of people's just livelihoods, right? So these are kind of the principles that I'm going to try to cover that I've been working with myself. So one of them is family love, and I mentioned that. Like, what does that look like all the way through your whole job and your whole world? And particularly, what does that look like when you are making decisions for other people's families, right? And I think that was something that was underscored already, and I really thank so much Jay for kind of setting me up for the lob, I would say, because he really underscored that in a really beautiful way, that as planners going into other communities, unless you are those families, it's gonna be really hard for you to tell. It's like somebody coming to your house and telling you, hey, here's how you should run your house and your family. Nobody knows better how to do that than your own selves, right? So I want to talk about that family love, and this picture is important. Like, every picture in here is meaningful for me, because that person right now, Bridget Rojas, a teenager that I've been working with since she was 11, she's turned 19. She is now teaching bicycle safety for us, and that's her getting paid in our organization. And my friend Jessie, who I've been working with a long time, we've known each other for 6 years, we've gone on a lot of bicycle tours, like hundreds of miles at a time. So this is how we build family. It starts also looking at how do we build family within our work. Respect for all life will be another conversation I'm going to talk about, and I'll get to that. Leadership by the people. Identify your power. Interdependent healing / planning. And then wealth for the people. So that's how I'm going to try to cover it in a very short time frame. So the first thing that is important, and to me, is acknowledge the indigenous land. So I'm using this particular one. This is created by my brother, actually, Miguel Ramos, of mapping out Los Angeles County and acknowledging the Tongva, the Chumash, and the Tataviam people. Those are the indigenous people first of the land. I think what's really powerful about this particular image is that my brother Miguel made sure that he included all the native flora and fauna of that area. So that's an important element too, is when we think about the land we're on, we actually have to think about the land we are on, right? Despite how much concrete there's been put, red hawks still fly in Los Angeles. There's still white mountain sage in Los Angeles. It's a pretty big deal. And I'm imagining that it's the same here in Florida. And so I want to take a moment. I am on the ancestral land of the Seminole folks and the Miccosukee people, and apologize if I didn't get the name correctly. But this is important for me to acknowledge the ancestral people's land we are on. Often they've been erased from even the conversation and what's... Yeah, thank you. And what's really important is that the people, the ancestral people of this land have been living in harmony with these lands for thousands of years. So they know something about planning a place to live in. And what's profound about this area when I was flying in is you have the Everglades. That is one of the most amazing, rich resources in the world. Like environmentally. So how do you in Fort Lauderdale and all of this area with this contend with how beautiful of a place you have that is also suffering vastly? Because I've also heard of the massive suffering that the Everglades are going through. So how do we return back to that? And you look to them for leadership. There's no excuse. I just looked it up. You can Google it. You know, so I don't know them. I do hope that I get to meet some of the elders, but there's elders and tribal councils who might be more than happy to share. But if you do, please do make an offering. It's very important. We don't just come in to take ideas for your work. You come in to respect and you make a deep offering. It's very important. So I wanted to move on there. So now I'm going to introduce People for Mobility Justice. So that's the organization I work with. And our mission states this: as Black, Indigenous people of color, we seed critical consciousness about mobility justice in all communities. The critical consciousness piece is very important because often what is not talked about is that a lot of planners, even within our own communities, are planning in ways that are devastating, not because they mean to or even intend to, because literally the conversations that broach critical conscious thinking about race, gender, and all the intersectionalities that was mentioned are not being taught. So people often do a cookie cut, and that's sometimes what's scary about academia. It teaches you how to cookie cut. And that's not what we're talking about. Critical consciousness actually means getting into the community and thinking about it at the land space and the people that are there, right? The other thing is our vision, and so I really love the freedom piece again. We envision a world where people have the freedom and resources to move in public spaces with love and dignity. That's very important because everybody should always feel free, not that fear of like, geez, will my son come back? Will my kid get hit? Will my grandma get hit, right? What does it mean to create streets, communities where people can walk with love and dignity? So that's a really important concept, and I think that's something that everybody will have to do internal explorations about. So moving a little bit, kind of taking it in a different place, and I think where it is a little bit hard in identifying that critical consciousness piece is that sometimes we are in different places of power, right? We are positioned differently by a variety of locations, whether it's by job, race, class, education, etc. It's a very complicated map. Like literally looking at our own individual power and privilege is a very complicated map. But I wanted to give I just wanted to do a touchstone really quickly on our project that we did with the Blue Line, the First Mile, Last Mile, which did get an APA award for the Grassroots Initiative in 2019. And this was conducted with Metro LA. And I was skeptical when I was part of the group that was doing this. And below you'll see all the different organizations. It says it right there, so I won't read them all off, but we worked in solidarity, I will say that. And one of the things that we were talking about was that, hey, we're not that excited about this blue line, first mile, last mile, because we're afraid that what it's actually going to do is going to displace everyone along that blue line. And that blue line corridor runs from Long Beach to downtown LA. And so that was something we were particularly really concerned about. And so there was a moment, and in addition to that, Metro also said, hey, but can you do a lot of the outreach for free and find donations? And then at this point, we created a solidarity block and said, no, you guys are one of the richest agencies in the world. You most definitely have money, and we're going to go ahead and do what we call the solidarity block. We just build solidarity. We say we're going to pull off the contract. We're not going to do community engagement. This doesn't seem authentic anymore. This seems like a cheerleading plight, right? And so in our negotiations, what we asked Metro to do was that we wanted to make sure, one, we had the funds to actually do it, so it wasn't coming out of our small grassroots nonprofit pockets. But the second and third things were also really fundamental. Is we said, if we're going to go to the blue line, first mile, last mile area, we need to make sure we actually talk to people about knowing their rights, because what we have seen along the blue line is the over-policement of black and brown, particularly young men. So we said, we're going to have to talk about things. You're going to have to allow us to set up booths with Know Your Right people. And the second thing you're going to have to do is allow us to talk about the evictions that could potentially come in with this, and the foreclosures. So we're going to need to also bring other groups that do, like Eviction Defense Network, and other groups that do protect tenants' rights. And this was our negotiation rates, was we're not going to go out into the community and parade blue line first last mile without people at least being aware of the consequences that can come with it, right? And ultimately we said, and can you get your cities to comply? And of course their answer was like, well, these are zoning issues by the city. I'm guessing a lot of you go through that. And I said, yes. And at the end of the day, if you can leverage your power, can you please say it, right? Because ultimately we know that historically, even from the transcontinental railroad, communities get displaced when massive transportation is done, right? Like this is just hand in hand, and you can see it globally. So one of the things that did come out of what I call the thumb wrestle, because it just felt like wrestling over like emails back and forth, was one of the results, and I do want to give it a shout out to Therese McMillan, who's now the CEO at the MTA in the Bay Area, was that they ended up, one of the results from this was the Metro Equity Platform Framework. Anyone heard of it? If you haven't, yes, some of you, if you haven't, you should go to Metro Los Angeles and look at the Metro Equity Platform Framework. But this is in one of their things. There's many things, but one of the things that I thought was really powerful in the name was here. It says, this is, by the way, approved by the board of Metro, which is a huge deal, by the way. You have inequity, fundamental differences in access to opportunity, race and class, historically and concurrently, predominates disparity in LA County. I think that's important that it was documented. We still have yet to see the implementation of it, but the fact that it was called out was really important. And this report here that you see there where the blue line is, it's literally a mapping of the redlining districts around the blue line, and this is now incorporated into the official Metro Board report. Like, this is actually Metro produced, but we did take a long time to fight for it. And then we had Monique Gonzalez from Pueblo and Sumir Gant help write this. So I think this is an important little just small step of victory. We have yet to see the implementation, right? But I just wanted to share that. And again, here we did have to identify our power. As CBOs, we had to understand our value to have community engagement. We really had to understand that. And Therese McMillan, who was the chief of planning, had to understand her power of what she can move there. So that's part of what I'm talking about when I'm saying identify your power. I'll move forward. So these are other levels of power that I think require some self-reflection, but also looking at it through kind of a geographic space. And you have, and this is actually Jesse who's there, who actually created this. And they actually were bringing a conversation of this to the untokening. And if you haven't checked out the untokening, check it out as well. They do some really powerful work around mobility justice and what that means. But one of the things we were talking about was how exploring the forms of kind of power or even oppression, right? Like, even to name it even more boldly, is we have internalized forms of oppression, we have interpersonal, institutional, and systemic. And a lot of folks here working within the institutional and systemic place. And that's where it's going to be really important for people to figure out, like, hey, where's my power? High unemployment, that is a result of a system. It is not a result of the people, right? Exclusion from services, that is a result of an institution, not a result of the people. And that's the thing that I challenge all of us to really think about. How do we get our most disenfranchised communities to the services, to the jobs, to the quality healthcare that everyone deserves? And it should be high quality for everybody. It should be high quality for everybody. And one of the things that I find really difficult that in hearing some of this stuff is we talk about what I've been hearing a lot in conversations is this balance between level of service, right, or the traffic flow, right, versus like the death toll, right? That is profound that we are having those conversations as a vice versa. Because what we are saying is that it is okay to have people die, that it is an acceptable form of collateral damage. That is profound. And in nowhere, as engineers or planners, should we be thinking that, hey, we don't want to slow down these streets because we got to keep going. So it's okay if we have a few deaths a year here. It should be zero. That could be your grandchild. That could be your grandma. That could be you in the future. Are you planning the future? Like, are you planning the future for your grandchildren? Are you planning the future for you to age? We will all be elders at one point, you know, God willing. We will all be elders. Are we planning that community now, even for ourselves? And so those are deep questions that I ask people to really just contend with and sit with. And it is a heavy ask. It is. And it does mean sometimes saying no to our most loudest citizens, because they're usually the ones that want fast streets. It really means to actually give voice to the silent ones, those who have already died, to the silent ones, those who have already been displaced, right? To the silent ones who have already been incarcerated. That's our job, is to figure out how we can give voices to those people. And if you can't figure it out, then just definitely go right into the ground, right where the people are at. They will tell you the voices of them because they have felt the impact of the lost. They will tell you. They will tell you how to do this, how to correct this. So I wanted to take that moment for you to really sit with that. It's a heavy ask, but it's love. It's actually called transformation, and it's actually called love, because love is not easy. It really requires deep reflection on our part. And so one of the things that is important in doing that is what I call interdependent healing, for us to successfully create communities that will suit and meet the needs of our most disenfranchised people. We need to work collaboratively. So just like the DOTs need to work with the public health departments, on the side of the grassroots, mobility justice folks need to work with healing justice folks as well. These are all the communities and movements we are in solidarity with. We're for youth, we're for older elders, Black Lives Matter, gender justice, social justice, all these things we have to think about when we are doing our work as mobility justice advocates. And the same thing for Department of Transportation and any city planner or official. You gotta think about that, like, how does public health have to intersect with my work? How does mental health intersect with my work? And asking yourself that question so we can create this beautiful community that's actually integrated holistically. And we've done this siloing effect, but now it's time to come back and bring it together, because the healing happens amongst all of us together. The last thing I will mention is that we are working on this mobility justice certification to talk about some of the issues that is available for professionals to talk about things like decolonize, decriminalize, decongest, dignify, and dream. And this all in the context of what it means to do mobility justice. So it does mean that we're looking at cross movements around the nation, but more importantly, we wanted to ground it in local movements, because there's already so much work happening on the ground. And so we'll be releasing that, so we'll keep everybody updated. So the last thing is, I just wanted to give everybody thanks. I wanted to thank also the Urban Health Partnership folks who've been doing a lot of work to coordinate this. And this is just our contact. Please do connect with us, tweet us, whatever you need to do. But we definitely are happy to be here, and thank you very much for your time.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Awesome. There you go. You got that? Go for it. Well, that was wonderful. We're going to have questions coming up soon for real, but we're going to just transfer right away to Crissy.
Great.
Great.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you for having me here today. It's been such an amazing conversation that we've had just even in the last hour, and so I can only imagine everything that you guys have heard today. So thank you for having me be here and be a part of it, because this is just a good reminder of why I do this work, because this is about people. It's about humans, and it's about how do we do work together and think beyond just what we want and need for ourselves as individuals, but how do we work on behalf of people and with people to do a better job. So I just thank you for the opportunity to be here. So many things to talk about, and again, we're going to try to get through this pretty quickly so that we have an opportunity to have a conversation with you all. But these are the things that I have been thinking about over the course of my career. And the issues that are listed up here, they are not different in any community. Many of the same issues. The scale might be different, the context might be different, but the issues are often the same. And so that's to the point earlier about are we polarized in this community, in this country right now? Yes, we are. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to find common ground and see where we are the same, whether it's from an urban or rural perspective or whatever those dichotomies are that we try to put out there. There's a lot of work for us to do the same. Thinking about transportation, not just as how do we get from point A to point B, but what is the transportation infrastructure, both the soft infrastructure and the hard infrastructure and the social infrastructure that goes with all of that. How does that actually make better communities and better places and better access for people to get to jobs or to school or to healthcare or to see their friends and family, because it's not very often that we're moving one place to another simply because we want to drive our car or ride a bike and maybe go for a walk, but we're going someplace. We're trying to get someplace. And so how do we do a better job? How do we think about what the economic development impact is, not only to the broader community, but to us as individuals? If I don't have freedom of mobility, if I don't have access to get to places, to get to school, that will affect how successful I am in my life. And that will affect how successful people in our community will be. So how do we do this in a way that is really thoughtful and does provide that mobility freedom to people so that they have opportunity in their lives? Transportation is a challenge, and I feel like there are some issues, particularly in the transportation industry. I'm here from Colorado, and maybe it's different here, but certainly the way we talk about it in Colorado is if we can fix it, we're going to fix the problem. The problem with that, from my perspective, is that when we talk about fixing it, the way we think about it is from our own individual perspective. I was leading a mobility working group with Mayor Hancock a couple of years ago, and we asked everybody in the room, like, what's the problem with the transportation system? And everyone went around the room and answered it from their own personal perspective. Well, if there was just a double ride at Holly and Monaco, then I could blah, blah, blah. No one was thinking about it from that community perspective or that broader perspective. And we also weren't talking about what is the right answer, what are the outcomes that we're trying to reach. If it is, I can get in my single occupancy vehicle and drive from A to B, wherever that might be, in 15 minutes and park in front and when I get there for free, that is an unrealistic fix. Like, it's actually not going to happen. How do we think about the communities that we need to build? Those are their complete communities that people can actually thrive in. That's what we need to be talking about. That's what we need to strive for. Vision Zero, Rio already brought this up in terms of, who are we doing this for? And yes, is Vision Zero an audacious goal? Absolutely. What other goal would you have, to your point? I like to say Vision 10. Got any volunteers out there? Increased air pollution, greenhouse gases, all of these things, deteriorating infrastructure, not enough money. All of these things are issues that every agency, city, municipality, jurisdiction, we're all facing these issues, and they're not easy to solve. So why is it important for us to think about this from a community perspective? A third of Americans don't drive. So how are your children getting around? Do they have other ways? Are they just expecting you to drive them? What if you don't have a car in your community? What if you can't get access to the bus? What if you don't own a bike? How are children moving around? people that don't have a lot of money, if they don't have vehicles, how are they moving? We did the first citywide Denver transit plan a few years ago. We actually just completed it 2 years ago, but it was 5 years in the making. And when I first started talking about it, people were like, well, why would the city of Denver do a transit plan? Like, isn't that the regional transportation district, the transit district's job? And so I planted that seed and we watered it for a while, and a couple of years later I had a council person saying, you know what we need? We need a transit plan. I'm like, okay, we should do that. But it was really trying to get to the point of people who don't have other options, they only have the bus as an option. How do we actually make it work for them? Rather than it being this stigmatized transportation that doesn't actually work very well because it takes too long for you to get anywhere, and it's may not be safe. Our elderly people, we are all getting older. How are we going to continue to move around? How do we continue to stay connected to our community? Because if we get into these spaces where we're isolated, and this can happen at any time during our life, but we've got to have that connection to community. That's what we are built for, is to actually hang out with each other. Social media, I think, has challenges for us from that perspective, but also the way that we build cities and the land use and the way we've separated things over time make that harder as well. Health. This is an old statistic, and I learned this from a good friend of mine who works in public health. And when I said this many years ago to my transportation professional industry in Denver, there were audible gasps in the room. And when I shared this with my friend Monica, she was like, really? She said, that's such yesterday's news from her public health perspective. So how do we do a better job of working across industries, across issues? Because we're not going to solve these problems alone. We're going to solve these problems together. And when I look at this statistic, those are my children, and I care about my children and the other young people that we're bringing into this world. We need to do better. So when we start talking about transportation planning and economic development and community development and community benefit, we really have to be thoughtful about who is benefiting and who is not. So these are all the statistical neighborhoods in the city and county of Denver. These are what we could label the communities of concern. It's 30% of the city. This is where there's a higher incidence of asthma and disease, chronic illnesses. This is where people have lower household incomes. These are the neighborhoods where there are higher incidences of crashes resulting in serious injuries or fatalities. We have to be thoughtful about our communities and how we're addressing them. This is where there's been lower economic investment. This is also where they don't have the ability, perhaps, to gather together and say, hey, let's create some sort of a business improvement district or a maintenance district, what is a lot of we've done in the city and county of Denver. Is that's how you make your neighborhood more beautiful, is you pay higher taxes and then you make it more beautiful. Well, what if they don't have the opportunity to even organize, much less tax themselves to make something more beautiful? So how do we think about the policies that are more equitable in terms of how we deliver better places for people? This is the high injury network in the city and county of Denver. 50% of Denver's traffic fatalities occur on 5% of the streets. 39% of all traffic deaths and 47% of pedestrian deaths happen in the communities of concern. It's unacceptable. So we have historically built streets and, quite frankly, buildings for cars. I purposely picked some of these to show what we're talking about from a land use perspective, because I spent so many years, and I'm not an engineer, I'm a planner, but I spent so many years hearing complaints from the community about engineers. Oh, the engineers have ruined everything. Curses the engineers, right? The planners are just as guilty. The architects are just as guilty. Like, we, as human beings, in terms of what we've been wanting to do, are just as guilty. So how do we take responsibility for our role in that, and then how do we start thinking about things differently? because we've created these streets where people are they're speeding because nothing is telling them not to. Doesn't mean that you have to, because that's like, as a driver, something about getting in that car, we just start driving and all of a sudden we're driving really quickly because there aren't any physical cues to tell us to do anything differently. At the same time, the only way that you avoid giving a speeding ticket is to not speed. People were upset in Colorado about red light running cameras. They're like, well, it's just trying to make money. And I really appreciated that the governor at the time said, if you don't want to get a ticket for red light running, don't run the red light. Speed is a critical factor, and you see the statistic there, 40 miles per hour, which may not feel very fast when you're actually in your car driving, but you have a 73% chance of dying or having a life-altering injury. So please, slow down. Because it is your grandmother, it is your grandchild, it is your aunt, your uncle. I have a niece and nephew 3 years ago. Their father was killed in a motorcycle crash. I had to come to work on that Monday, and we had the executive management team meeting, and there we were discussing this fatality. And I have to be honest with you, before they knew it was someone who was related to me, they were being pretty crass about it. This is personal. We have to recognize that. We have to do a better job. So efficient streets, we built them for cars, but when we start thinking about these, and these are old pictures, I'm sure you guys have seen this in other places around your profession, around your time frame, is we've built them for cars, and we think about full streets as being full, but they're full of vehicles. They're not full of human beings. We generally travel around with one person in our car, and that's not using our streets efficiently. So let's think about how do we make that better and actually use them for people. How do we create better efficiency? How do we value our limited and complex, the public right-of-way that we have? We've got to value it more because, and rather than complete streets, I like to use the term living streets. So living streets are places for people. They're not places for cars, they're places for human beings. And they're very multidisciplinary. I talked about this earlier in terms of who has to do this work. Yes, you can yell at the engineers, but also remember that the engineers are there to help us actually solve problems. And they like to solve problems, but how do we frame it in such a way that they can help us solve the problem that we need to solve? But don't forget all the other people that are here at the bottom of the slide, because they all are going to help us too. I always used to tell people, I'm like, I could build a street that had amazing brand new, asphalt and beautiful lines with paints and striping, and it could have a nice sidewalk and maybe even lovely trees next to it and pedestrian lighting. But if the land use adjacent to that brand new street is crappy, it's still a crappy place for human beings. So we have to design these streets with people in mind and with people collectively. In Denver, during our Living Streets initiative, which we started back in the 2007-2008 timeframe, we actually would go into the community. We would print out the aerial of their neighborhood arterial that was nearby and say, and then we had puzzle pieces. So we said, build the street however you want it to build. And so they could put in car lanes, they could put in transit lanes, they could put in wide sidewalks, they could put in planted medians. And the very first time we did this, we were in a community in Northeast Denver in one of the areas of communities of concern. And the woman was playing with the street, and she came over to me and she said, I think I'm done. I said, great, let's go take a look at it. And as we were sitting there, we were looking at the street, and it was before I had a chance to even respond, and she looked down and she said, oh, she goes, I didn't put any lanes in for the cars. Is that a problem? There's not enough room to do everything that we want to do. And so how do we prioritize that? How do we think about this? Where our community values are, what kind of places do we want to build, and how do we help educate the community doesn't have their professional planner degree or their professional engineering degree or doesn't do transportation all the time. How do we deliver it in a way that people can actually understand and play around with and say like, we've got to make hard choices. We were playing this game in another community, and there were two people talking, and there was a gentleman who owned a business on the street, and he said, well, I really want on-street parking. It's important for me, for my business to thrive. And the woman who lived down the street, off of the main street, but around the corner, she said, well, I don't care about your on-street parking. Like, I actually walk this neighborhood with my children and I need a wider sidewalk. So we don't have agreement about what's most important, even at the neighborhood scale. It's important to ask that question and make sure, as Jay was talking about earlier, get all the voices in the room. Who's not there? Because we have to hear those things. And quite frankly, they need to hear each other. I was at a community meeting not too long ago where we were talking about a big arterial in Denver called Colorado Boulevard, and the community that was just to the east of that neighborhood, or that arterial, was like, oh, well, they were really upset because there was cut-through traffic. So the woman asked if we could just, can we just close this block of this parkway so then people couldn't go through and come down our street because they're frustrated with the congestion, and that way they can go and just keep going away and not come down my street anymore. So another woman who was in the room, she said, well, then they would come down my street. And so then they started to understand that there are trade-offs in all these things, and it's a system, it's a network, and it's never going to be perfect, but how do we do these things together? And how do we think about the arterials versus the neighborhood streets versus the collector streets? How do they work together as a system, and how do we prioritize moving people efficiently in the right places and protect the neighborhoods and the communities from that kind of traffic that's where it's not intended to be? The return on investment, and I know from an economic development perspective, everyone wants to talk about and be able to point to and say, this makes sense. And there is good data. Well, there's not good data. There is a little tiny sliver of data to start to point in this direction. These are from New York City, and I was really frustrated because I was looking for other places, including the city of Denver. Like, it's so easy to say, well, we're not New York City, because where else is New York City, right? And where else are you going to find that kind of density of human beings where they can see these kinds of increases in terms of the sales that are happening? What we need to start recognizing as transportation professionals is how do we collect this data at the front end of our transportation project, and then thinking about it later. I think it's a fairly new practice to think about how does complete streets and living streets, how does it impact the community around that? Not only in a positive sense from an economic development, we have more sales happening, more sales tax revenue occurring, what have you, but also think beyond that of what happens next. What are the threats? What are the concerns that we have to have for the people that are in that community before, and are they in threat of being displaced? We were doing a transit-oriented development plan in Denver. This was many years ago. And I think one of the challenges for planners in particular is we talk about the highest and best use of land. Well, you can't go into a community and say, well, in 5 years, this is going to be a transit-oriented development, and, basically what we're telling people is none of this will be here. People, that is their homes, it is their businesses, it is their livelihood, and we need to honor that and respect that, and not just simply say, well, it's not the highest and best land use, and therefore it should change. We've got to be much more thoughtful about this and how we move forward, and think about what are we looking for in the data when we talk about economic return on investment. Living streets can make life more enjoyable. And if you're someone who only has the ability to move on transit, and you're thinking a lot of people only want a train, bus transit can make a huge difference. In Denver, they recently changed to a bus-only lane on 15th Street downtown, and they are seeing a 42% increase on time savings. So imagine if that's your commute, 42% increase that you just got from A to B faster. Like, it's a huge quality of life impact for you. It's my opportunity to maybe have 20 more minutes at home at the end of the day with my kids, or 20 more minutes at home at the end of the day to spend with my ailing mother. This time matters, and we've got to be thoughtful about how we do this so we can move more people more efficiently. Living streets are better streets for people. Mobility freedom is a choice that those of us that are in the city building industry have an opportunity to do a better job of. It is not easy work. You all know that. There are no magic fairy dusts out there for us to just sprinkle around and say it's done. The only way we do this is we commit to it as city builders, and we work across industries and across disciplines to do more and to do it faster. And that takes courage, it takes care, it takes leadership. And so I encourage all of us in this industry to do more and better of that so we can do more and better for the people in our communities. Thank you.
Thank you. Wow. My saddest takeaway from that is that there isn't fairy dust to fix this. That's my big takeaway from. First of all, I want to just thank you both for your wonderful presentations. Thank you all once again for that. And I want to say that Rio and Crissy are extremely brave because we met very briefly. We did not have a pre-planning meeting. And you know, sometimes with these panel discussions, there's those canned questions, and the person's expecting the question, and then they kind of answer the question to continue their presentation. We didn't do that today. So I wrote down a couple questions that I have that kind of popped in my mind, and I'm hoping you all also have questions. And I'm just checking it with technology. Are we good with, do we have people that need microphones, I see, and then do we also have the Slido? Have people been using Slido? Awesome. So what I will do in the name of justice and fairness is that I will go back and forth. I have a couple questions, and then I also want to go to the Slido, and then we'll also have some microphones, and we'll just do it that way. Is that a good way to have this? And we have actually tons of time for conversation, so thank you all very much for that. So the one thing that I was struck the most about is 2 years ago I talked about coming to the first Safe Street Summit and being completely unaware about these conversations. I didn't even know what built environment meant. I didn't know what a complete street was. And to me, the idea of transportation and street infrastructure is a very technical thing. Today, I'm blown away by first Jay and then your presentations of really bringing in the lens of justice and health equity and inclusion and talking about indigenous people, which really is why my organization, Allegheny, has gotten involved in this. I may share a little bit about what we're doing, but my first question to you all is, when you're in a room full of engineers, you're in a room full of planners, you're a planner, how do you get people in government in particular who have these dollars that they kind of think are very restricted to actually care about asthma, right? When you mentioned asthma in yours and you talk about indigenous people, how do you get people to actually get interested in that and not see it as a burden to the work that they're doing?
It's a good question. I think it is one of the challenges that we face in the public sector, or maybe anywhere, is we get in our lane. And so the color of money matters, and like, I have dollars and they're to do X, but they're not necessarily meant to do Y, like deal with asthma. So part of it is just the education and the awareness, understanding that that it matters, that there's an implication, something for us to be thinking about, building those relationships across the industries, across the disciplines, so you can actually maybe address more questions, more issues at the same time. So how do we improve the opportunity for collective impact? The only way we do that is if we're willing to actually work together. So first of all, you have to educate them to know, so they know there's a problem, and then start looking for opportunities to, whether it's a little bit more funding or being more sensitive in the design that we're building, so that we can actually address problems together. But it's not easy to do, because I think people do just want to stay in their swim lane and go, because it takes longer to do these projects when we start thinking about them more complexly, but we do better work at the end of the day.
Yeah, and I'd just like to add that I definitely agree with that, this idea of working together. And I think for us, what we have found is that it's kind of like a turtle process, and we hope we can reduce some of that bureaucracy, because a lot of that turtle process is coming from bureaucracy in an unhealthy way. But a lot of
Can you describe what you mean by turtle process?
So it's slowing it down, and basically what I'm saying is that we've been working on the metro stuff I say as a community since 2007, right? To even get to the point where we have in Youth Justice Coalition, definitely want to give a shout out to them, has really started a lot of that work. So now that's 2007 where it's been really concrete hitting it all the way down to 2020, right? So it's taken a long time. So that's from the CBO side, right? But on the government side, things that I'd like to see that I think could help out is that I know at least in Metro, they just hired a chief of equity and race. I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but a lot of DOTs are also following suit across the nation. And that will hopefully make things not so slow, right? We hope that that's just literally hitting it at the head with the issues we're talking about. Leave it at that.
Right. All right. And so I am going to take first question on Slido, and then we had a woman, I believe, in the back over there. If you can stand and identify yourself, we can get the microphone to the woman back over there. So question from Anonymous. That's brave. Are there accommodations projects that are working to include and consider those with special needs for various modes of transportation networks? Either of you?
It is a huge challenge to think about that. And again, I want to go back to the education component of things. When we were doing the Living Streets initiative, one of the women who was working for the city and was on our committee was actually in a wheelchair. That was the only way she had to get around. And so her insight was really valuable to help us think about that differently. We actually took the opportunity to take the mayor at the time, Mayor Hickenlooper, and he had to experience the street for a day as someone who had to use a wheelchair. So again, bringing that awareness to folks is something that's important for us to think about as we design projects or conceptualize projects so that we can do something about that in the future. The American with Disabilities Act is out there, but it doesn't necessarily help us in transportation projects to address all the needs that are out there. I know Denver has been addressing the curb ramps, so at the corner, they'll build a curb ramp so that it is accessible, but it might lead to, that's the end. There's no sidewalk connecting. How do we think differently about our capital projects and the way that we fund them and require us to think about things? In 2007, there was a bond in Denver, and there was money in there for rebuilding projects, rebuilding streets, and a question was asked at that time, well, should that include sidewalks? And I, of course, argued, yes, it should include sidewalks, but the policy decision was made to not include sidewalks because therefore they could actually rebuild more streets. So we have to make sure that our elected leaders, our internal leaders inside of government, and also our community leaders are doing more at a better job for us to bring the knowledge and bring the issues up so that we can actually start to address them moving forward, because it's definitely more addressed more often today, but it's still not addressed on a regular basis.
And then my 2 cents on that is just, again, in every single local jurisdiction, there is somebody who's working around disability issues, somebody who's working with people who are disabled. Go to them directly to ask these questions, and of course, compensate. And the last thing I mentioned is Dara Baldwin, who works with the National Center for Disability Rights, is also another good resource to have it there. The resources are there, and it's just a matter of going to it and finding them.
Great, thank you. We have a question over here. Yep, you, go for it. Your mic's live, go.
Oh. Me?
Yep, yes ma'am.
Hi, I'm Amanda. I'm actually holding the mic for all of you. So if anybody would like to ask a question.
Oh, I'm sorry. So I saw a hand, someone raised their hand over in that area.
I'll step back here right
All right.
now.
So keep raising hands, and you guys get my attention if somebody has a question out there, because it's kind of hard to see out there. I'm going to jump to actually the next question over here, and it has lots of popularity. When are we going to stop heavily subsidizing private car trips? I don't know if that's a fair question for you too, but go for it.
Well, I think one of the interesting things that's happening with the micro-mobility technology that's coming into many cities, whether it's scooters or bicycles or whatever it might be, that many of which were just dropped, and there's this frustration about, like, well, we need to charge these people, these small companies or even large companies, for access and use to the public right-of-way. And so as I'm actually part of the Denver Regional Council of Governments, which is our MPO in Denver. There's an advanced mobility planning group that's getting together. And one of the questions they asked just last week was, well, when are we going to start, charging for these private vehicles that are offering services, mobility as a service? When are we going to start charging them? And all I could think of was, well, will we be willing to extend that to acknowledge that we all drive private vehicles? And so perhaps this technology moment that's hitting us will actually help us connect to the fact that we are all driving private vehicles, and while we think we're all paying enough taxes to address our transportation and mobility issues, we're definitely not. So again, bringing that awareness around to what are we using our public streets for, and how can we do a better job, and who should pay? And our private vehicles are part of that, because we do subsidize way too much for that, and we don't even think about it. We think that the bicycle should pay or the transit rider should pay, and we don't think about all the things that we're just subsidizing in because it's the way that it always has been, and we need to think about the new right way moving forward.
Yeah, and I definitely ditto and echo all of that. And then just other things that I wanted to throw out there is we co-hosted with PolicyLink and Transform a webinar on congestion pricing, and if it would, and how can we make it equitable. So that's available out in internet land. And the other thing I'll just add on, just subsidizing private car trips, is I think one nugget of it is really thinking about who's driving it and for what purpose, right? Because there is some people that will just need to drive for their livelihoods, and they might be low-income folks. So that is a very tough question. But overall, that is something that's impacting what we're calling the greenhouse gas emission, right? A lot of that conversation is happening right now. And what's unfair and unfortunate is that there's greenhouse gas emission communities that are producing it, and then there's those communities that are burdened disproportionately by those greenhouse gases because they're not really using cars. So that's something that's definitely of equity importance.
Well, maybe I just add in one other component there, because I think it's an important one, is having the courage to have that kind of policy change, particularly I will call on our elected leaders. That's not an easy thing to do from a political perspective, but it will certainly require elected officials and community leaders to be courageous and take on a policy that is not going to be probably very favorably received with the general electorate. But if we're not willing to take on some of those hard issues, policy issues, as community and elected officials, then we actually continue to fail doing a better job for our communities overall.
So I had a question, and I'm going to sort of tie it to one of the questions also from Slido. Someone asked them, how do you handle the biased concerns of white privileged communities that don't understand or care about others from diverse backgrounds in transportation? And I'll just couple that with one of mine, is that we talked about how do you get not just the community, but how do you get even the people creating the policies to care? But I wonder, in addition to that, just what is your biggest barrier? What is your single biggest barrier that you wish you could tackle and not have to address any longer in the work that you guys are trying to do around justice? Sort of tying those two together.
I think a lot of the things that I think about when we're talking about bias concerns of white and privileged communities is, at a fundamental level, there is a level of who's being dehumanized and who's not, right? And I think these are really hard conversations to have about race, right? And perspectives of race. And ultimately, that's where a lot of, I think, the bias comes from, is that particular point. And then that really, to be addressing that, it does create, how do we create communities that are cross-cultural, right? How do we create interagencies that are cross-cultural, right? In that true way of thinking of everybody. And we use the word disenfranchised very intentionally and purposefully, because it's talking about communities that have been systematically kept from resources, from education, from accessing wealth, right? And so it's actually getting to the bottom of that. What Metro is doing to address some of this, which again, I'm a little bit impressed, and I want to see what the rollout is GARE. If anybody has heard it, it's the Government Alliance of Race and Equity. I definitely recommend that kind of programming, or any other type of programming that is literally addressing issues of race, class, and all those intersectionalities within your government agencies, because it's sometimes it's just embedded in the way we grew up. It's not even something that we intend to do, right? And so this is where I talked about why critical consciousness is important. It's really broaching that, because you might not even know that that's what's happening. You might not even know that a bias is happening. Those are just things that sometimes require another level of education.
And so that education would actually then address that biggest barrier, right? So if the organization takes the responsibility of educating not just themselves, but their entire system of sort of how those implicit biases and all impact the work that we do. Yeah, that's great.
Well, and I think going back to Jay's questions that she put up earlier and asking who's not here, or maybe we want to flip it sometimes and say, who are we hearing from? Because if we're, and I was just reading something on the way here, people are frustrated in Denver, like who is showing up at the meetings and who is making the decisions, because quite frankly, in Denver, it's mostly older white men that are in those meetings, and so they speak as though like, well, I am representing the what do they call them in Denver? The RNOs, the representative neighborhood organizations. And so they speak as though they are speaking on behalf of the community, when in fact it's a very small sliver of folks that they are speaking for. So how do we think about the systems that we may have set up with registered neighborhood organizations or whatever the system may be in your community? Are we actually setting up a system that actually invites and brings the communities the voices that we need to hear beyond sort of your typical, this is who we've heard from? So how do we open those doors? How do we recognize that the system actually isn't working and create a new system that actually can be much more inclusive and diverse?
All right, so there's a question over here about funding that's coming from government, but before we go to the funding coming from elected officials in government, I was curious, who funds you all? Who's your primary supporters for the work that you're doing?
Well, we are a small nonprofit, actually, so it's often just looking for grants, right? I think we're looking at different grants and different funders. Sometimes we do government contracts, but usually as a sub-consultant that we've been able to do. And again, we are very thoughtful about which contracts we get into, and we're very much willing to negate contracts that are exploitative. So we've done this before, where a government agency sends us back a contract that we want to sign, and we'll just say, no, that's actually not addressing any of the issues. Or if it's an ask about a funder that is asking us to compromise some of our fundamental ideals. So we want to make sure that we continue to have literally the freedom to speak on behalf of our communities without any restraints, without any worry about like, hey, are we being politically incorrect? And so we're lucky that way, but it also makes it extremely difficult to get funding.
And I think from a public sector perspective, oftentimes, and I think to your point, Rio, let's say there's like a multi-million-dollar project, capital project that an agency wants to implement. And then they'll say, oh, well, and then we have a small sliver of this multi-million-dollar project is set for communication and engagement with the community or what have you. And then there's probably, of that engagement, there's a much smaller, if anything, budget to really reach out into the community and get to this deeper level of inclusivity and voices. And so I think to your point, I think the government sector needs to do a better job when they fund projects to think about those things up front, probably long before they get to a capital project perspective, because it needs to be thought of from the conceptual and the planning before it gets into that. But when you get into those big capital projects, there actually should be funding available to support these kinds of organizations to do this work, and to also be mindful, to your point, about the roles that we all play and what we need to be able to say. When you are working in the public sector, sometimes there are things that you're not able to say. It's not because you don't believe in them, but we kind of have to understand the push and pull. And my experience working with advocacy organizations was I knew sometimes they were going to throw me under the bus, not me personally, but the work that I was doing on behalf of the agency, and it was right for them to do so. we needed that voice at the table, and it wouldn't have meant as much if it came from me or someone on my staff. It needed to come from the external side of things, but I've got to build the relationship and the trust with the advocacy community that I have to know that no one is saying that to be mean or spiteful about me or my agency. They're saying it because it needs to be said. And so let's respect those roles and responsibilities, but it doesn't mean that we don't pay them for the work that they need to do, because quite frankly, they do the work better than a public sector agency can do.
Yeah, I love that. It makes me think of the one book, the Four Agreements, and one of the agreements is not to take things personally, right? To realize in the work that we're doing, we are all collectively working towards the same goal, and sometimes we need things to be said to us that are uncomfortable, and not to take it personally.
Yeah, a couple of years. So we finished our Vision Zero plan a couple of years ago, and the city has been working on the implementation. This was shortly after I left the city, actually. And an advocacy community that calls themselves the Denver Streets Partnership, they did a report card on how Denver was doing on implementation of the Vision Zero action plan. And they did not score very high. And so the response from the communications people within the city, they brought in the advocates and they were like, well, can't you just give us a nicer grade? Because they were getting bad press. And so there's this desire, I think sometimes, and this is not just in the public sector, I think it's everywhere, but there's this desire to actually not tell a bad story. Oh, we'll just clean that under the carpet and then everything is fine. But what we really have to be willing and courageous about is transparency. And so we need to be willing and able to get called out by folks when we should be called out. So a good friend of mine always says that transparency will set you free, but first it will piss you off. And it should.
I guess I'll take this moment just to share a little bit about me. I was a little strategic in asking that question about who funds you all, because as a foundation, this is not an area that we have necessarily been funding, but my eyes were opened a couple years ago, and since then, we first sponsored the next conference, and then we really got to know the team of Urban Health Partnerships, who is just amazing, and the organization that they've done for this, amazing. And they did, with the justice work that we're doing in Overtown in Miami, they did a walking audit for us. I never heard of a walking audit, but and it didn't even cost that much. And I was like, oh, sure, absolutely, you're gonna get the community. So they grabbed the community and we did a 2-hour walking audit of the neighborhood and got feedback from people of all ages and demographics from the community. And then the outcome of that ended up being a project that we're in the midst of right now that I'm not even sure exactly what the end result will be, but it is doing, I forget the term now, you guys are gonna kill me, but I heard in one of the other workshops today the work that you guys are doing, but it's essentially working with the community. They've hired 4 individuals from Overtown, residents of Overtown, on staff for the next 18 months to work in community to get ideas and feedback from community in order to create projects that they'll be able to implement within community. And I just think it's awesome and so my whole point with that is I don't think we would have funded that had I not been at this conference 2 years ago. And I am shocked, even again this year, that we don't have foundations in this room. We don't have private donors in this room, that this is seen as a government conference. And I'm just confused by that. I really think we have to really integrate this conversation beyond this group of people. And I hope that we can do a better job of that as we move forward. I think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions. I just want to make sure there's no one out there with a pressing question that you haven't raised your hand. To be fair, the question was specifically around funding to support public transit in Miami-Dade. I don't know if you guys have any specific answer to that. I mean, that's very, very specific, and I think if there's anybody in the room who would like to respond to that, you're welcome to. Anybody have a response to that? No, it was tired of traffic. So I'm going to ask my last question then, if there's no questions in here. I'm going to ask a question that just is something that I love to ask when I meet people that are working in the area of justice. in particular, and that is, why do you do this work? And I actually believe that there are specific things that have happened in our lives that sort of fuel us in getting behind social justice and understanding equity. And maybe that's not true, but I'm just curious if you all have anything specifically that you would like to share with us as to why you're in this work and this is so important to you.
There's probably a really long story there about life and experiences and kind of what you bring to the work that you do. I mean, ultimately, I do this work because I love it. I just love it. I care about communities. But I think a lot of it was just my experience growing up. I mean, growing up, I rode bikes, I took buses, I grew up in Denver, like Denver proper, and my experience was very multicultural for where I grew up. It was, the neighborhood was Park Hill. It was like always sort of 50-50 African-American, white. So I never really thought, I just thought that was, honestly, I felt really naive as I got older because I thought that was the way it was for everybody until I went to college. And I went to college and all of a sudden I was like, oh, not everyone thinks that we've gotten over these things. Like there's still issues. And so I felt like an idiot, quite frankly, because I was expecting everyone to have the same experience that I had. And so knowing how much I valued my experience growing up of having that kind of diversity in my life and recognizing that there's a lot of work to do in our communities, like it just feels like it's second nature for me. And so trying to help everyone else move to a place where we are asking these questions about who's not there and how do we do a better job and make the community better for everyone and improve access. Like it just seems like it's the right thing to do. And I enjoy the work very much.
Well, thank you for doing the work.
My answer would be, I do it for my mom. I do it for teenage Rio. I do it for my partner's daughters, Ichera and Yaretsi. I do it literally for family. And particularly when I think about the mom piece, is my mom actually was cleaning homes when I was growing up, which means we traveled from Echo Park to the more wealthier suburbs in LA, and that took nearly 2 hours each way. So when you talk about why communities of color are having a hard time dealing with health and education, you're talking about my mother taking 4 hours of commute just to work and literally get paid $30, if that, to clean a whole giant home, right? And so with that, I do want to take a pause to also say thank you to all the hotel service workers here today. Like, they deserve a round of applause. Leave tips at your hotel rooms. There's a lot of people who are cleaning at a minimum wage right now who probably have families of who knows how many they're dependent on, so please take care of them as well. Yeah, but I also think about myself as a teenager. I had to take sometimes 8 buses to get to school. So when we talk about rates of truancy and absency, we're looking at some of us traveling 8 buses a day to and from. That's absurd. Those are the things we need to look at. And so we often villainize our teenagers for not wanting to go to school, but it's really hard to get motivated to go to school when you know it's going to take a lot of effort. That's not even on top of all the social context that you will have to engage with, right? Which could come from just street harassment to also police harassment, right? So talk about, like, take care of our teenagers so they can actually get to school, to get their after-school programs, to their health areas. And the same thing with our elders, right? When we talk about elders moving along and getting to their own health, like, can they do it? My mom can't see anymore. She can see, but she can't really drive anymore. And honestly, like, even I have to reflect, like, how do I make this better for her? Like, because now she needs a driver, and now she can't just even walk regularly. So how do we create streets that could take care of her? Otherwise, yes, she's dependent on us. We have to be there for her. So this is like profound issues that I think probably all of us have it in here, one way or another, that it's very real. And if we can bring that realness to our works and be like, I am advocating on behalf of all of us, that is our responsibility as people with the platform to do it, to advocate on all of those who are unable to meet us at that table. So I think that that's really important to me. And yeah, I just want to close off with, again, thanking everybody here today and just wishing all of you the best of luck as you, hopefully all of you are looking to make it really transformative in your jobs. And I know that it's not an easy play because maybe not everybody at work would think the way you do, but I wish you the best of power and luck and blessings so you can do that in a good way so that our communities can just really shine the way they need to. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Have a round of applause for our speakers. Thank you. Very good. And so that actually is the end of the conference. And I'm going to ask you guys to give me just 2 minutes to wrap up. I think that this has been an incredibly educational day for me, and I'm hoping for you as well.